Isabella? Oh my God, what happened to you?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble.
You're 7 months pregnant. Why are you outside?
Sir, this isn't the first time.
What did you just say?
Every time you leave, things change in this house.
Dorothy, please, don't make things worse.
Worse! Look at you, honey! You're freezing!
Tonight, she refused to sign some documents.
Documents? Whose documents?
Your mother's, sir.
My mother locked my pregnant wife outside?
Honey, what your mom did doesn't really matter. My belly hurts.
This isn't right at all.
An order was given, sir.
Who gave that order?
Your mother, sir.
Mom.
Some homecomings feel like relief the moment the headlights hit the driveway. And some homecomings feel wrong before a man even steps out of the car. And for Jonathan Hale, the second his tires crunched onto that long gravel drive at 3 in the morning, something in his chest told him this was going to be the second kind. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. He had cut his business trip short by 2 full days. A decision he made almost on instinct after a phone call with his wife earlier that evening had left him with a strange, uneasy feeling he couldn't quite name, her voice sounding thinner than usual, distracted in a way that didn't match the woman he had married. Rain had been falling steadily for hours by the time he finally turned onto the estate's private road, heavy enough that his headlights barely cut through it, the wipers working hard against sheets of water that blurred the outline of the house ahead of him into a dark, indistinct shape against the night sky. The first thing that struck him as wrong was the porch light. It was always on, every single night, rain or clear skies. A small standing rule in that house that no one had ever questioned in 5 years of marriage. Tonight it was dark, the entire front of the house sitting in a heaviness that made his stomach tighten before his mind had even fully processed why. He tried the front door out of habit, and found it locked from the inside in a way it almost never was at that hour, a detail that on any other night might have seemed unremarkable. But tonight sat wrong in his gut the way certain small details sometimes do right before you understand exactly why they should have alarmed you sooner. He moved around the side of the house instead of standing there working through explanations that weren't coming, some instinct pulling him toward the garden, scanning the darkness for any light, any sign of his wife awake somewhere inside those walls. What he found there stopped him completely. Froze him in place in a way nothing in his entire career, nothing in the dangerous, unpredictable world he moved through every single day, had ever managed to do before. Beneath the narrow awning of the old groundskeeper's shed at the edge of the property, curled against the cold with nothing but a thin coat wrapped around her 7-month pregnant belly, was his wife, Isabella, soaked through completely, shivering even in her sleep. Exhausted past the point where her body could keep fighting the cold any longer. For one horrifying second, Jonathan Hale, a man known throughout an entire city for never once losing his composure in the face of danger, simply could not move, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him, his wife, carrying his child, asleep outside in a storm at his own home. The one place in the world he had always believed was completely safe for her. Before he could even fully process the sight in front of him, the back door of the main house flew open, and Dorothy, the housekeeper who had run that household with quiet steadiness for longer than Jonathan himself had been alive, came running out into the downpour with an armful of blankets. Dropping to her knees beside Isabella with a mixture of fury and tenderness that told Jonathan immediately this was not the first time Dorothy had come looking for his wife in the middle of the night. Jonathan Hale had left his pregnant wife safe inside his own home 2 weeks earlier, certain, the way he was certain about very few things in his life, that nothing could touch her behind those walls. He had returned in the middle of a storm to find her locked outside in the cold instead, and standing there frozen in the rain, watching Dorothy work quickly and carefully to warm his shaking wife. He understood with a dread that settled deep into his chest that whatever Dorothy was about to tell him was going to force him to question every single person he had ever trusted inside those walls. Jonathan dropped to his knees in the mud beside them before Dorothy could even finish wrapping the second blanket, gathering Isabella carefully into his arms, her lips faintly blue, her skin cold enough against his hands that his own voice cracked calling her name. She stirred weakly, eyes fluttering half open, and the first thing she managed to whisper wasn't relief at seeing him, wasn't fear, but an apology, soft and confused, telling him she was sorry for being outside, as though she believed she had somehow done something wrong simply by needing shelter from the storm. That single sentence, more than anything else in that entire terrible scene, was what finally broke through Jonathan's shock and turned it into something colder and far more dangerous. A fury he had not felt in years rising up underneath his fear. Dorothy met his eyes over Isabella's shoulder, and in that single look, exchanged in silence while rain poured down around all three of them, Jonathan understood clearly that this had happened before, more than once, and that Dorothy had simply reached the end of whatever patience had kept her quiet about it until now. To understand exactly how Jonathan's own home became the place his pregnant wife nearly froze to death in a storm, you have to go back 8 months earlier, to the man Jonathan Hale was before that night ever happened, and to the family he had inherited without ever fully choosing it for himself. Jonathan had taken control of his father's operations 5 years earlier, respected across an industry that rarely rewarded fairness with the kind of quiet, methodical leadership that made him unusually well-liked for a man in his position, though that respect came at a steep personal cost, requiring him to travel constantly, managing territory and business relationships that stretched across 3 different states. He had met Isabella Reyes during one of those business dealings, a hospital administrator whose department he needed cooperation from, drawn immediately to a directness in her that refused to be intimidated by either his family's reputation or his own considerable wealth. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that Jonathan's mother, Patricia Hale, attended with a smile so carefully constructed that only those who knew her well could see how little warmth actually lived behind it. Patricia had made her disapproval of Isabella clear from nearly the very beginning, believing quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, that her son should have married into a family with standing and connections rather than a woman who had built her own modest life from nothing, without a single powerful name attached to protect her. Dorothy Simmons, on the other hand, had welcomed Isabella into that household from her very first day, a woman who had spent decades working for the Hale family, having raised Jonathan's own younger sister within those walls before her death years earlier, and Dorothy had never once, in all that time, treated Isabella as anything less than family. There had been small warning signs in those early months that Jonathan, busy building his business and easing into married life, simply hadn't recognized for what they truly were. Patricia's smile would tighten almost imperceptibly every single time Jonathan's car pulled out of the driveway for another business trip, and household routines would shift subtly the moment he was gone, small rules appearing and disappearing, depending entirely on whether Jonathan himself was present to notice them. More than once, Patricia made comments to Isabella about adjusting to how things were really done in that family, delivered with a smile pleasant enough that objecting to it would have made Isabella seem unreasonable rather than justified. The situation began deteriorating in earnest roughly 6 weeks before that storm, during an extended business trip that kept Jonathan away far longer than usual, communication reduced to brief, exhausted phone calls across time zones that left little room for Isabella to explain what was actually happening inside that house while he was gone. Patricia began instituting new household rules almost immediately after his departure, framing each change as simple tradition, the way things had always been done in a proper Hale household, rules that Isabella found herself expected to follow without question or explanation. At a particularly cold dinner one evening, Patricia commented directly on Isabella's pregnancy in front of visiting family, wondering aloud, with a smile polished enough to seem like genuine concern to anyone not paying close attention. Whether Isabella was truly strong enough to carry a Hale heir properly to term. Isolated, increasingly exhausted by a pregnancy that demanded more rest than she was being permitted, and unable to reach Jonathan most evenings given the difference in time zones, Isabella found herself confiding quietly in Dorothy, who quickly became the only real ally left inside a house that had once felt like home and now felt increasingly like something closer to a cage. It was during this period that Patricia made a comment to a visiting relative, just within earshot of the rest of the household staff, mentioning almost casually that she had handled difficult daughters-in-law before, a remark that landed with a weight far heavier than the light tone she delivered it in. Patricia's control tightened further as the weeks went on, moving Isabella into a smaller guest room under the excuse of ongoing renovations to her usual quarters, restricting her access to certain parts of the house entirely. On the night of the storm itself, tension between the two women finally broke into open conflict when Patricia pushed a set of documents toward Isabella regarding portions of the estate's holdings, documents Isabella refused outright to sign, without Jonathan present to review them himself. Furious at being refused, Patricia instructed the night staff, all of them except Dorothy, who happened to be off duty visiting her sister that particular evening, that Isabella was resting and should not be disturbed under any circumstances, a directive that effectively left Isabella completely alone and unable to summon help once she stepped outside briefly for air and found the door had locked automatically behind her. Exactly the outcome Patricia's instructions had quietly guaranteed. 7 months pregnant, exhausted from the argument, and unable to raise anyone inside the house despite knocking as long as her strength allowed, Isabella eventually made the difficult decision to seek shelter in the old groundskeeper's shed rather than risk walking to the front gate alone in the dark and the rain. Dorothy, returning from her night off far later than expected due to weather delays on the roads, immediately sensed something wrong in the unusual quiet of the house, and upon discovering Isabella missing entirely from her room, began a frantic search of the grounds that led her directly to the scene Jonathan himself would discover only minutes later. Arriving home unexpectedly early from a trip he had cut short on nothing more than instinct. Once Isabella was safely inside, warmed, and examined by a Dr. Dorothy, called the moment they got her through the door, the news came back with tremendous relief attached to it, the baby unharmed despite everything, though Isabella herself was left shaken and running a low fever from prolonged exposure to the cold. With his wife finally resting safely upstairs, Jonathan turned to Dorothy for answers, and what she told him, calmly but without softening a single detail of what she had witnessed and pieced together over recent weeks, forced him to confront the uncomfortable reality that serious cruelty had been happening inside his own home for weeks, while he believed his family was completely safe. When Jonathan confronted his mother directly, the first true confrontation of his entire adult life between the two of them, Patricia did not apologize, and she did not deny what she had done. Instead, she defended her actions as necessary discipline, insisting she was protecting the family's legacy from a woman she still, after 5 years of marriage, refused to fully accept as truly one of them. Jonathan stood in that room torn in a way he had never experienced before, caught between the mother who had raised him and the wife carrying his unborn child, forced finally into a reckoning he had spent his entire adult life quietly avoiding. It was Dorothy, sensing the weight crushing down on both of them, who finally offered a truth she had carried privately for over 20 years, one that reframed Patricia's cruelty without ever excusing it. Patricia herself, Dorothy explained gently, had once been a young bride brought into that very same family from modest means, treated with the exact same coldness by Jonathan's own grandmother decades earlier, made to feel disposable and controlled for years until she eventually adopted her mother-in-law's methods simply as a means of surviving inside a house that had never offered her genuine warmth of its own. Dorothy also finally revealed the deeper reason behind her own fierce, immediate protectiveness toward Isabella, explaining quietly that she had lost her own daughter years earlier during a difficult pregnancy, in a household that had offered her no support at all during the hardest days of her life, and that she had made herself a private promise afterward that she would never again stand by silently while a pregnant woman under that roof went unprotected. This revelation did not erase what Patricia had done, but it reshaped the way Jonathan understood his mother, recognizing for the first time that the coldness she inflicted on Isabella had been inflicted on her first, decades earlier, inside these same walls. Rather than banishing his mother from the family entirely, the response his fury initially screamed for, Jonathan made a decision that satisfied neither extreme his world usually demanded of him in moments like this. He formally stripped Patricia of any authority over the household during his absences going forward, establishing Isabella clearly and permanently as the one in charge of that home regardless of who else was present, and he required his mother to make genuine amends rather than simply offering the kind of hollow apology that changes nothing at all. What followed was not instant forgiveness, and it was not a clean, easy resolution, because real change rarely moves that quickly or that simply. A tense, quiet conversation between Patricia and Isabella some weeks later opened a door neither woman had expected to find, Isabella extending a measure of grace toward a woman who did not entirely feel she deserved it yet, understanding now, for the first time, some of what had shaped Patricia's cruelty long before Isabella ever arrived in that family. Months later, Isabella gave birth to a healthy daughter, and the estate that had once felt, for those difficult weeks, like a house built on quiet cruelty, slowly began feeling instead like an actual home. Jonathan restructured his travel schedule significantly, no longer willing to leave his family's safety to chance or to anyone else's judgment, while he was away building a business that, in the end, meant nothing at all if it couldn't protect the people he loved most. Dorothy, given a formal place of honor within a household she had served faithfully for decades, was the one who first held that new baby out on the same porch where Isabella had once been found soaked and shivering in the storm, sunlight now warm across that same ground instead of rain. Patricia, still finding her way slowly towards something resembling genuine change, watched that moment from a respectful distance, no longer excluded entirely from her son's family, but not yet fully welcomed back into its center either, a redemption still very much in progress rather than a story that wraps up too neatly to be believed. And on that same porch, months after nearly losing everything in a single terrible storm, Jonathan stood beside his wife watching their daughter sleep peacefully in Dorothy's arms, understanding now something he wished he had understood far sooner, that the old groundskeeper's shed where he once found his wife shivering and alone had since been repainted and turned into a small garden house, no longer a place of exile, but simply one more part of a home that had finally, truly, become whole.